I used to think the worst thing in life was losing something you loved. I was wrong. The worst thing is losing something and not even knowing what it was. 3 nights ago, I ran from something I should have never seen. And ever since, he's been coming back. Waiting outside my door. Leaving pieces behind. And the worst part? I think he already took something from me. I just don't know what. Welcome to Eerie Short and Scary Stories. I worked in a factory in London, the kind of place where the air sat thick with grease and metal dust, where men wore the same tired expressions day after day. It wasn't much of a life, but it was what I had. What I was building for Gwen and me. Gwen stayed in Godstone, in the little house her parents left her. It wasn't far, just a few hours' journey, but the distance felt like an ocean. I visited when I could, once a month if I was lucky, twice if the foreman wasn't watching too closely when I slipped out early. Then the stories started. They came in quiet whispers at first, over pints in dimly lit pubs, in the cautious voices of men who spoke as if they feared being overheard. They called him the Rag and Bone Man, a collector of sorts. People said he roamed the countryside at night, a towering figure draped in layers of patched fabric, moving with a slow, deliberate gait. No one saw his face, not really. Those who got close enough to describe him never quite agreed on what they saw. Some said his skin looked like stretched leather, others swore it was more like cloth, sewn together in strange, jagged patterns. But it was the victims that made my stomach turn. Bodies left behind in fields and alleys, slashed open, not just stabbed, not just killed, but altered. Pieces missing. Small bones, fingers, ribs, sometimes just a single vertebra plucked clean from the spine. And those who survived, well, they weren't quite the same after. No one could say what he really took from them. Only that they weren't whole anymore. I laughed when I first heard it. Another old wives' tale. Another bit of folklore meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods at night. I'd grown up hearing stories like that. Things that lurked in the dark, things that waited just beyond the edges of lantern light. But this was different. It wasn't just one story. It was everywhere. A new name spoken in fearful tones in every village I passed through. The same warnings repeated by people who had never met. Then, one night, I heard the name whispered in Godstone. That was when the fear took hold. That was when I stopped laughing. Because Gwen was alone in that house. And I wasn't there to keep her safe. It started with the papers. Thin, crinkled pages smudged with ink, folded hastily and discarded on train seats, left on bar counters, tucked under the arms of men who read with furrowed brows and murmured to themselves. I never paid much attention to the news. Too full of politics, scandals, things that didn't concern me. But this was different. This wasn't a war overseas or another tax on men like me. This was happening here. The headlines caught my eye first. Bodies found in Surrey woodlands. Mysterious mutilations in Sussex. A collector among us? The words themselves might not have meant much on their own, but the details beneath them made my stomach lurch. Every victim was found with bones missing. Not whole limbs. Not the usual brutality of a common murder. No, these were small, delicate extractions. The metacarpals from a hand, the fibula from a leg, the vertebrae from the base of a neck. Taken with surgical precision, as if the killer had been picking out choice pieces like a butcher at a market. And their clothes, torn, yes, but not in the way you'd expect from a struggle. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate, patterned in ways no one could explain. The police reports never used the word, but the papers did. Ritualistic. I swallowed hard, folded the newspaper, and tried to forget it. But then I saw the name. Godstone. It was buried in the middle of an article, barely a mention. The latest victim, a farmhand, had been found not far from town. Just a few miles from where Gwen slept alone in that house. Miles from anyone who could help her if she screamed. I left work without clocking out. The foreman shouted after me, but I didn't stop. My hands trembled as I packed my things, as I shoved what little money I had into my pocket. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself it was just a story. But the fear was already there, thick and choking, whispering a truth I didn't want to face. I had to get back to her, before it was too late. The train ride stretched on longer than I remembered, each mile dragging beneath the weight of something I couldn't name. The cold gnawed at my fingers, slipping through the gaps in the rattling windows, but it wasn't just the weather. There was something else. Something pressing against my chest like a hand I couldn't see. When I stepped onto the platform, Godstone was wrong. It was all still there, the narrow streets, the clustered cottages, the damp air carrying the scent of distant wood smoke, but it felt hollow. Like someone had scooped out its insides and left the skin behind. The streets were empty. No lamps glowed in windows, no voices carried through the cold. Even the pub, always lively no matter the hour, was shut tight. I kept walking. Halfway up the hill, I saw him. A man, if you could call him that, standing perfectly still at the base of the slope. He was enormous, taller than any man I'd ever seen, broad in a way that made my stomach lurch. His coat hung in tattered strips, long enough to brush the ground. Beneath it, something moved, shifting ever so slightly, like the fabric itself was breathing. His face. I don't know if he had one. The more I tried to focus, the more the details slipped away, like my mind refused to hold onto the shape of him. But I knew he was looking at me. I felt it like a weight on my skull. A gust of wind rattled through the trees. The silence swallowed it whole. I should have turned around. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to go back, to board the train, to pretend I never came. But Gwen was ahead of me, somewhere beyond that hill, alone in our house. I forced myself to move. The moment I stepped forward, so did he. Not much, just a fraction, just enough to let me know he was real. A game of patience, of distance. I picked up my pace. So did he. I didn't run. Neither did he. He didn't have to. I don't know why I looked. Maybe it was the way the air felt thick around him, pressing into my skin, making my throat close. Maybe it was some deep, instinctive part of me needing to understand what I was up against. Or maybe I had no choice. Maybe the second I got close enough, he knew I'd look. His face was stretched too thin, like the skin had been pulled tight over bone. Except, it wasn't just skin. There were patches of something else, scraps of cloth, stitched and layered, blending into his flesh. A jawline of frayed burlap. A cheek covered in waxy, yellowed lace. Where his eyes should have been, there were hollows, deep and dark, but I could feel them watching. And his hands. He held them out just slightly, like an offering. In one, the fingers curled around something small, something pale. Bone. A row of them, threaded together on a thin strip of sinew, polished to a dull shine. I felt my stomach lurch. His breath came low and rasping, the kind of sound that doesn't just come from the throat, but from something deeper, something not meant for speaking. What will you trade? I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My body moved before my mind could catch up, and suddenly my legs were pounding against the frozen earth, the wind cutting sharp across my face. Behind me, the sound of footsteps. Heavy. Steady. Not running. Just following. I reached the house, nearly collapsed through the door, my voice raw as I called for Gwen. No answer. I fumbled through the rooms, throwing open doors, knocking over furniture. Nothing. And then I saw the window. The latch was undone. The glass, smeared with something dark. And on the sill, laid out neatly, deliberately, was a small collection of bones. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, the truth settling into my bones, cold and inescapable. He hadn't come to take. He'd come to collect. I barely remember bursting through the door. My legs burned from running, my chest heaved, but none of it mattered. I only cared about one thing. Gwen. And there she was, standing in the dim glow of the lantern, her eyes wide, her hands clutching the front of her dress. Alive. I almost collapsed with relief. I stumbled forward, reaching for her, needing to hold her, to feel that she was real, that she was whole. But she didn't move. She didn't rush to me the way I had imagined. She only stood there, watching. Something was wrong. I opened my mouth to speak, to say anything, but she beat me to it. Luke. Her voice was soft, almost uncertain. Why won't you look at me? I did, didn't I? I had been looking right at her. But now that she'd said it, I realized I hadn't. Not really. I had been staring through her, past her, my mind still lost in the nightmare outside. I forced myself to focus. Her face, the delicate curve of her cheek, the worry in her furrowed brow. She was here. She was safe. And yet, she reached out slowly, her fingers brushing my arm. Cold. Too cold. Her touch sent a shiver through me, not just from the chill but from something deeper, something I couldn't name. My breath caught in my throat. Luke, she whispered, why do you have a tear in your coat? I looked down. The fabric was ragged at the edge, a long strip missing from the sleeve. A piece had been taken. No, not taken. Traded. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. My mind raced, piecing together something I didn't want to understand. He had asked me a question. And somehow, I had answered. The rag and bone man never took without a trade. And I had given him something. But what? That was 3 days ago. 3 days since I ran through that door, since Gwen touched my arm with those ice-cold fingers, since I saw the tear in my coat and knew I had given something away. At first, I told myself it was over, that he had taken what he wanted, that whatever silent agreement had been made in the dark, on that road, had ended there. I told myself that as I held Gwen close that night, as I listened to her breathing while the lantern burned low. But I was wrong, because now every night I hear them. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing just beyond our door. They don't shuffle, don't drag. Each step is placed with purpose, with patience, as if he's waiting for something, as if he's waiting for me. The first night, I sat up in bed, my body rigid, my fingers gripping the blanket so tightly they ached. Gwen didn't wake. She slept soundly, her breathing deep and even, unaware of the thing that stood just beyond the walls of our home. I wanted to wake her, to tell her we had to leave, but I couldn't move. I could only listen. And then, morning came. I found them just as the sun crept over the hills. Small bones, pale and clean, placed neatly on our windowsill, laid out in a careful row, as if arranged by a steady hand. The second night, the footsteps came again. Closer this time. Slower. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my breath felt too loud, too uneven. I knew he was just on the other side of the door. I could feel him there. And when I woke, another row of bones awaited me. I still don't know what he took from me that night, what I traded away in my blind terror. I've looked at myself in the mirror, searched my reflection for something missing, something different. But I see only myself. At least, I think I do. The third night, I heard something new. A voice. Whispered. Ragged. Just outside the door. What will you trade? If you found this story interesting, share it. Let more people see what really happens. And if you want to hear more true crime cases like this, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories out there, some waiting to be told, others still unfolding. This was Eerie Short and Scary Stories. See you next time.